In January 2007, I was hired by 2 Australian filmmakers to shoot a documentary in the Sahrawi refugee camps of Western Algeria. I spent 3 weeks in the camps with the Australian filmmakers, shooting a film about family reunions sponsored by the United Nations. Fatim, the protagonist of their film, was to be reunited with her mother after being separated by the war for over 30 years. A couple of months later, the filmmakers returned to the camps to continue shooting their film, this time without me. In May, I heard the news. According to news reports, Violeta Ayala and Daniel Folshaw were detained by the Polisario as they discovered the widespread practice of slavery in the refugee camps. The Polisario denies the claims.
Sorry, I'm Violeta Ayala, the Australian journalist who have found slavery in the camp.
And there is no slave in the camps?
There is not slave. Well, I know it's a slave. You can't tell me there is not.
Well, you can go back and tell us who is slave in the camps.
A bitter dispute has erupted over the accuracy of a taxpayer-funded feature documentary screened at the Sydney Film Festival. The film, called Stolen, features the story of Fatim Salam and her family, who live in a refugee camp in the Algerian Sahara Desert. Fatim Salam has been flown to Sydney by the independence movement that runs that camp to enable her to denounce her depiction in the documentary as a slave and the allegation that such slavery is widespread in the camps.
Can I see your tickets, please?
Fatim Salami has travelled halfway around the world from the Western Sahara to crash the premiere of a feature documentary at the Sydney Film Festival. A documentary in which she is one of the principal characters.
طبعاً غضبني لأنه في مسائل كامل المعادلة فيه جات عكس ذلك كنت أنا عيني عليك.
I feel that it's not Fatim saying it. My gut feeling when I see her saying those words is that someone's made her say it.
I decided to return to the refugee camps to retrace their steps and to find out how I could have missed the fact that 1 out of every 6 refugees is a slave. During the filming of Stolen, I forged a close relationship with Fatim and her children. A year before the Sydney screenings, as I revisited the camps in search of the truth, I spoke with Fatim, her daughter Leo, Salam, Matala, and Mbarak, all main characters in Stolen and alleged slaves.
مسكن في 27 فبراير نشتغل في التربية. جيت مع أمي ديدو من مازلت صغيرة، جيت انطلقت معاهم وجيت أمي اللي معاها محاضراتي، هي كأنها هي أمي اللي مخليتني أمي ذيك غير ديدو معلتها عنها، هي اللي مخليتني بيا اللي جبرت فيها من شي صالح، رباتني ولاحقتني ذا القد وقريت، دخلت المدارس، دخلتهم من مازلت صغيرة، دخلت في التربية ودخلت القراية وثقفت الحمد لله وعدت عمره وبخيمتي وبتركتي، لا بفضلها هي اللي لحقتني ذا القدر، وذاك اللي عدلت يديدو من شي صاحبتي ما تنقدر ننساه. وحد كامل يقول عنها خاطفتني والله قلعتني من امي، راهو كاذب، لان هديدو رايك انا ما نقدر نبدل بحد ثاني يسوى هو من هو.
واذن عنا امال اللي هي منين جات، من جهه الاول ومن جهه الثاني، عن احنا ما قدرنا قاعد نفكروا. انا هي تشتغل للمغرب والله الدور تشتتنا، والله تقول عن فينا العبودية، والله أنا حصفيطين، والله بها اللي ما تقدر تصح، ما خارج شيء ما تقدر تقوله، يقال عني أنا، والله العبودية إذا قاعد شيء ما هو خارج، وعن فيطين كيف طريق مننا هذه وكيف ذاك كامل، بماتنا، ولمات لورا ذاك ولورا ذاك، وأهل الصحراء كاملة، إذا عنها كاملة أولاد وأخوت وأحباب.
Pues Dedo es normal con Fatima, es como si fuera su hija, es normal como una hija suya. O la cuida más que sus hijas, le quiere más que sus hijas. Pues ella lo inventó, entonces ella les dio dinero a gente, no sé, fue a otras partes a preguntar y dando dinero, entonces consiguió las palabras que ella quería. Pero vamos, que era mentira toda.
I spent 3 weeks living with Fatima and her children in her house next to Dedo. I observed a normal family life in which Dedo fulfilled her role as any grandmother would.
I was in Sydney in June 2009 to attend the Sydney Film Festival. I was going to write some reviews for the Business of Film, a magazine that I write for occasionally. So you told me that Fatima, who was a refugee from Tindorf refugee camp in Algeria, was coming out to protest her presence in a movie called Stolen, which was saying that she was a slave. So I went to the airport and met Kamal, who was the Polisario representative in Sydney, who was also meeting Fatima. She arrived the morning of the premiere of the film. And that night, myself and Pamela, my wife, went to the premiere at the Sydney Film Festival. Well, for some reason, the lobby was stacked with security and police, which was very odd.
Can you please tell, I do not give you permission to film.
But later on, we found out the filmmakers were concerned about protests, so they'd instigated the presence of a lot of security. And that gave an ugly vibe to the whole thing, frankly. The film ran, and at the end of the film, there was a Q&A.
I don't want to put Fatima under any more pressure than she already is. If Fatima would like to get up and say something, I welcome her. But I'm not going to say, Fatima, you have to get up and speak.
And Fatima stood up about 3 rows from the front and wanted to speak. And incredibly, the filmmakers just let her stand there for, to me, it seemed like an eternity, until people in the audience started yelling out, "Let her speak, let her speak."
You've only allowed him to speak once.
And she finally got to speak and said this, you know, she denigrated the film and said she wasn't a slave.
I am really free woman.
حريتي هي اللي جعلتني عني شي هون، هي اللي جعلتني عني نقرا وجعلت تركتي اقرا واذا كان اي حد ما عنده.
I am totally free. There is no slavery at all in that, and my children are free, and my freedom is the one who brought me here to Australia. If I wasn't free, I wouldn't be here. And that's my passport with my children in it. So that means I am totally free.
The filmmakers, I thought it was really odd. One of them, I think the fellow, said something like, "I feel really sorry for you that the Polisario has made you stand up and deny all this."
I feel awful that they're being marched out here to say it's not true.
Well, that was the question I had when I saw the film, and the question I tried to ask at the opening, but as I was booed down by the family and friends of the filmmaker.
So what I want to know is why weren't their owners, their so-called owners, questioned?
The question I asked was, well, even if it's true, what's your definition of slavery, and also who owned these young men who all claimed to be slaves, but then travelled to Mauritania and, you know, went off and did other things and seemed to be having quite a good time.
After leaving the camps, the filmmakers called Matala, Mbarak, and Salam and invited them to travel to Mauritania to meet them.
نحن مشينا معاها في قضية ما هو قضية العبودية ولا هو قضية السياسة. مشينا معاها عيطت لنا قالت عنا نعاونوها ونفهموها وفاق الشعب الصحراوي وكذا وكذا. يا غير ما هو على قضية عبودية. فهمتي؟ أنت اللي تظهر لنا الحقيقة ظهرت لنا الحقيقة منين عيطت لنا شور موريتان.
من ذاك ما عرفت علينا عاق ذاك ما قالت لنا باغي تقيسوا الشنط الريك دبركم تمشوا. قلنا احنا ما قايسين الشنط لنا شاكين. السفارات قلنا ما شاكل السفارة نصبحوا في الجرايد احنا كاع احنا مجرمين. احنا ما نطالب حق اللجوء. ذاك مفوت معنا ايام مشات بين قلنا تبين تمشي بين وتجي ذاك منين جابت لنا الفاضه مولي قالت له ندعمكم باش تشتغلوا انتم. جابت لنا الفاضه مانعه كان 400 ولا 500 المهم عنها جابت الفاضه عوم موريتانيا وطرحتها لنا.
We didn't pay anyone to be in the documentary. You know, I gave Matala, we gave T-shirts and things like this.
But no money?
No, we didn't pay them any money. Like we gave them money when they came to Mauritania, we gave them money to go back to the camps.
I enlisted the help of a friend of mine, Bob Ellis, a writer who was a filmmaker himself. Bob and I had written Newsfront, which was interesting Australian movie about Australia in the 50s. And he was an old friend of mine, a journalist. And like all veteran journalists, going in, he was skeptical of everything. He was skeptical of what I was saying. He was skeptical of what they were saying. He was open-minded about this. He'd been at the screening of the film, and he couldn't believe the film either.
And eventually turned up to meet them at Glebe at the house of Meredith Bergman, someone I've known for 40 years, who was for a time the leader of the upper house of Parliament in New South Wales, who was looking after them, and was very tiny, very beautiful, very black, very irritated, lovely young woman and her husband, who spoke to me in a language I didn't know, answering questions that I hoped to make short, and which were translated by an unsinister lawyer called Kamal, the attaché from the Polisario. And so we had the conversation, and I was utterly convinced that no slave would be allowed to fly unaccompanied on Qantas to a country as far as this.
But, you know, for Tim, in no way acted like an abused, downtrodden, enslaved kind of... Nothing could be further from the truth. And I can see why they felt really betrayed by this film, because they're so open that I could see they'd take anyone into their family, and they take people at face value, and I can see why they felt really betrayed to be called slaves.
And so the only other evidence they have of slavery is Fatim, who denies it and claims mistranslation.
An American government court certified translator gave us a certification that, and he said that anyone who can doubt the translations could call him. He works for the American government, and he is a professional translator that, you know, who studied in a big university.
The translator was Omar Sy. A month after the controversy erupted, he wrote an email to the filmmakers and to Polisario officials. While watching the film, I realized that part of the translation was not correct or accurate. I informed Ms. Ayala and Mr. Falshaw of the wrong translation. They committed themselves to rectify the wrong translations and then come to my house in Brooklyn, New York, to verify that my translation was indeed corrected into the film. However, 15 minutes before our appointment time, they called me to cancel it due to prior commitments they had. Since that day, I never heard from them. I regretted that they did not keep their word and respect the commitment they made to me. Therefore, I would like to reaffirm that I did not certify that the translations from Hassaniya to English, the final version of the film Stolen, are correct.
يمشي دمعك يا العين
The 7:30 report has obtained an independent translation of key sequences in the film from an interpreter for the Al Jazeera television network based in Doha. In this scene, Fatima Salami's mother and sister appear to confirm that she was a slave to her white foster mother, Dado. But the 7:30 report's interpreter translated the same scene quite differently.
Rather than correcting the subtitles, the filmmakers edited the scene out of the movie.
I will tell you a little story, because when I went to the Western Sahara, I showed Fatim's mother the response of the United Nations lady. And she said to me, "What do you call when you take a child away?" And I say, "Kidnapping." She said, "It's a crime." I said, "Yes, it's a crime." What did they say when they took my daughter and my 3 sons away from me? A cultural practice.
We went to El Ayoun, in the Moroccan-occupied territories, and spoke with Fatim's biological mother and sister.
اللي اصلا كاع سولتنا فيوليتا تمت نتشبتها لي انا بمسله لهيه وقالت لي مسله قالت لي فاطمه اصلا مختطفه ما مختطفه قلت لها هي مسله محاله من راسك ولا خارقه منين جاتنا هنا تياها تمينا قاعدين منين جات مفاجاه جاونا عند راهنا تمينا متباركين مع مناسبه اللي قال رواق جاو جيت عرفت جيت برعانه لباس وقالت راني نقيم للدار وراك ولج قبل ما يجينا هنا تم مرحبوا بيا وصلوا عليه تصور طاحت في الملهى وتصورنا سمعت تصورني عن وصورتني مازال لا جاي من وصل قالت لي كيفاش فاطمه مشات قلت لهم انت عم دايدو عائله كامله تتوارث موبايلات عائله كامله جايه ذاك سمعت من نضربها وتصورني انا وهي راكبه لقدام قلت لها عائله كامله تتوارث ذاك سمعت دايدو قريب لي وانا قريب لها خال دايدو والخالها ذاك سمعت والله كان مجورين ومن جات هون اللي تم تبحثنا ما قلت لها دايدو عنها مالك وفاطمه لا قلت لها انا تحرث عليه ولا قلت لها لا سمعت وراها متصوره مع دايدو راعاها متصوره مع امها اللي هي قاعده مضوبله التصوير راعاهم الحمد لله راعاهم شاهدين عليهم راعاهم الحمد لله هو قاع خدم له ما يخصو قاع ما يحط ما يشوف راعاها تصويره مضوبله قاع ما يشوفهم ولا يشوفوه وحد مكسوب كاع ما هو كاع اللي يشوفهم ولا يشوفوه راعاها انا معاه مع اختي راعاها معاها تركتها وراعاها معاها نسيبتها وهذا ما هو حد مملوك ولا هو حد مخطوف ولا يخلوش يتناقروا معاهم كاع ولا يشوفهم كاع ولا تزقنا كاع بينا ولا قضيه اختطاف والله تم مدخله لي الشك 3 تكرين يما اللي بالفضل راني هاي الكلمه قالت لي نعطيك مبلغ من المال ولا نعد قالت لي نعد لك باسبور ياك تمشوا معايا قالت لي تمشوا معايا لين ديك انت الاولى اللي بك صغيره ونعود قالت لي تطلبي انت على امك قلت لها انا ماني اللي نبيع راسي بالفضه ونسبب لعائلتي مشكله ونقول عن اختي مختطفه باش نقبل الفضه قلت لها هذه هي خالده محيها من راسك بليتي راني خالده كاع وقع لي معاها سوء التفاهم شوي تم تسوى الوالده كيف الا فطنت لها عطاتها الزر.
I traveled to London to meet Danielle Smith, an anthropologist that has studied Sahrawi culture in depth for the past 19 years. This is what she had to say.
I saw the film Stolen, and it's a very confused film, and I think it's a very manipulated film. And, you know, if it wasn't for the narrative that's imposed on it, anyone watching it would never glean the slightest indication that slavery is being practiced. I mean, it was kind of almost laughable, for me anyway, you know, to suggest that this woman, Dado, who was a former slave, you know, was being, you know, she was enslaving Fatim to do all these things. She doesn't know, the filmmaker obviously doesn't know anything about the society. I mean, first of all, it's a gerontocracy. I mean, you always do things for the elders. I mean, she's like her mother. So, of course, she's going to do things for her. But you see that in every family. So then every family is practicing slavery, really, because essentially, you know, if you're an elder, the younger always do things for you. That's just the nature of the society.
ديك ما هي عبودية عند حنا راجل كبير مقدس منين يجي واقف نعايلو يقد يعود يرتعد يقد يعود ما يقد يوقف يقد يعود ما يشوف نتلاقاو حنا لا من باب احترامه نعطوه النعايل سيامي ذاك راجل كحل سيامي هذا راجل هذا اللي نعرف ما ديك القضية عنها راهي ديك النوع من العبودية تطرح لها نعايلها والله ذاك ما ينحار والله ذاك هذيك ما يخابر.
In Stolen, Fatima Salami's daughter Lail certainly appears to suggest that slavery is still practiced in the camp.
Si Fatima no estuviera ahora liberada, viene los blancos y nos quita a nosotros y ella no puede decir nada porque es esclava. Pero nosotros...
Both mother and daughter later told Carlos Gonzalez their conversation was mistranslated and referred to the past when slavery was practiced.
مترجمة كيف مثلا تقول خالقين جمل قايلتهم أنا صحيحات قطعتهم هي تبقي الكلمات اللي عارفة عنها هي جاية في صالحها تبقيها كيف مثلا أنا قايلة فم إنه أي ديريتشو يعني قصدي في العالم كامل عن ذيك الساعة ما كان خالق ديريتشو أنتيغوش يعني قديم ما كان حقوقي غير منين تطور العالم وخلقت الثورة وخلق كل شيء الناس كاملة عاد متساوية يعني في هذه.
I've managed to learn a fairly decent level of Sahrawi dialect, Hassaniya. And in 1997, I was employed as a kind of field researcher for a 3-part documentary on Western Sahara. And I had to interview a lot of the elders, which was a wonderful experience. But it was very confusing in the beginning when they spoke, because there was this way of speaking about the past in a present form. Because it's almost like their storytelling is you know, very, very powerful, and you could really feel this in the elders. And the best way to bring something to life is to make it sound like it's happening now.
Young Dan said, slavery can be a state of mind. And I said, what do you mean, like Catholicism? And he said, we can't let religion into this film. I said, why not? Surely it's at the heart of it. I said, what, and you don't even mention what religion they were they Sunnis or Shiites? And he said, this is ridiculous, and he began to get up and walk away, and he was urged to come back. And I said, you know, you showed no details in the film of what the culture was like, how they were fed, how they were taken to hospital, how they were educated. And he said, well, you know, it's not about culture, it's about slavery. I said, it's not about culture.
The co-director, Violeta Ayala, she said to me, what is your idea of slavery? And I said, well, what do you mean? Do you mean Spartacus, or do you mean how you're portrayed it in the film? And she said, what's Spartacus?
In an interview with Radio National, the filmmakers could not properly explain the meaning of slavery, the main topic of their documentary.
The filmmakers, Violeta Ayala and Dan Falshaw, join us. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning, Fran.
If I can ask you, Dan, you went to the Western Sahara to record a family reunion, but you say you found modern-day slavery instead. What exactly do you mean by that?
I guess within the camps, the Black Sahrawis, they consider themselves, some of them consider themselves slaves. And that means that they are actually owned by somebody else, that they're the property of another person.
And Violeta, what does that mean in real life, to be owned by somebody?
Well, I think the definition of modern-day slavery, I don't know if that's correct. I think that this is old centuries of slavery that kept continue and modified or in different manifestations. Being a slave is a person that actually it's owned by someone else.
It was very difficult for us to get our heads around what slavery meant while we were in the camps. And it really is, for people outside of... it's so difficult to explain.
The reason that I realised that the film was just rubbish was that here were two young filmmakers. They'd only been there a few times, not for very long periods of time, and they had somehow discovered that there were 20,000 slaves it's quite a small area and only 160,000 refugees. So this is like 20% of, so 15% were slaves. Now, it's a very, very transparent place. It's full of United Nations workers, refugee agency workers, delegations from European parliaments there all the time. You know, we went there as an Australian delegation. There's been a number of Australian delegations. This is a place which is very open, and there were lots of visits going on to the schools and to the clinics and to the, you know, various events that were happening. If there were 20,000 slaves, someone else would have discovered them.
Violetta Ayaya believes slavery in the camps is institutionalised.
Okay,
and you
yes.
say here, slaves perform all the domestic work.
Yes, they do.
They're kept as concubines, raped by the members, they're not allowed to marry without their master's consent. And you estimate that there's something like 20,000
because it's what they told
20,000 in the Polisario camps.
Yeah, that's what they say.
And I think the figure, I mean, you know, nobody even knows, even the UN, who's been going there for years, and it doesn't even know exact number of refugees, how on earth her going there twice and, you know, meeting a single family, a couple of families, have any clue, I don't think, any indication of any census, nothing. I mean, for me, it's just a number that's been pulled out of a hat. That may be plausible, but for me it's just purely nonsensical.
International Committee Red Cross always had free access in the Sahrawi camps. UNHCR, all agencies you can think of. God, all these years, no one ever, because this is the first time I heard about slavery in the camps. It's totally absurdity, made up, I guarantee you.
2.500 asociaciones, 6.000 personas están, 6.000 voluntarios, cooperantes, expertos, están visitando los campamentos cada año, 6.000 personas. O sea, calcula lo que significa en términos de porcentajes, y te das cuenta que hay un voluntario, un cooperante o un experto cada, ¿qué es? 3.000 personas. No, bueno, 30.000 personas. Bueno, igualmente es un número, es una barbaridad. Que tan solo Violeta, entre todo, haya dado con ese clavo, parece mentira, honestamente.
Pour être franc, je pense que peut-être il y a un malentendu de dire il y a des milliers. Je suis vraiment désolé, ces milliers-là, ils sont où? De parler de 20 000, ça c'est aberrant. Je trouve que c'est trop exagéré. Et si ça existe vraiment, on va les voir. Il y a les gens qui vont venir, ils vont venir à toi étranger, de dire ce qu'ils ont dans le cœur, de dire que voilà, on en a marre, des gens nous maltraitent. Et ils savent très bien que c'est ces organisations, c'est dans leur éthique de dénoncer. On n'a jamais eu ça.
Me parecería extraño que yo no los conociera, que no conociera ni uno. Aparte de eso, nosotros hacemos distribuciones. En las distribuciones es lo mismo. Recorres todas las wilayas, recorres todas las dairas repartiendo comida. Igualmente, la población esclava, en caso de que existiera, sería la que cargaría esos alimentos. Tampoco los he visto nunca. Más siendo 20.000, entre 125.000 es un alto porcentaje. O sea, es uno de cada 6. No, no me puedo creer que no conozca a ninguno y que estén metidos en algún cubículo. No, bueno, no sé en qué cubículo, ¿no? Si las paredes se caen de las casas, o sea, no, por supuesto no puedo decir que sea cierto, para nada.
I've been coming to the camps now for 4 years. My first trip was 4.5 years ago, and it's been 2.5 years that I've been coming regularly for 2 to 4 months at a time. All that time I've lived with the family in a nearby neighborhood to the school, and I've been teaching in the school for 2.5 years. I've never seen anything remotely resembling slavery among the people. Anything that they would have within themselves, like color or social status, all of that seems to fade away when it comes down to their issue of independence, and that unites them more than anything else would divide them. Yes, Omar is a student here and a staff member. He was one of the first students here, first semesters. He's been working with us now for probably about 2 years. We've had conversations about race and that there are some issues that he's a darker color here in the camps. Nothing about slavery.
There's a little girl, 2 years ago, 2 years old. When I meet with her, when I touch her, she told me, "Don't touch me, because you're black. If you touch me, I will be a black like you." But she's only teasing. But there's segregation, like people, you are a black, you can't be like here, or you can't have this job because you are black. There's no this kind of segregation.
I've been going to the camps for 19 years now, so I've had the privilege of seeing the society kind of evolving over 19 years. And having a lot of contact and extended stay with people there. So it's given me an exposure that's given me a chance to just really see human relations as they are, because after a while you can't hide things if you're trying to, and it's a very intimate society. I mean, it's very hard to have any secrets in the Sahrawi context. And, I never, ever detected any kind of slavery going on. But I certainly I've detected racist feelings or, prejudices, definitely. And, when it comes to marriage, and I think we find that in any society, though. I mean, we have our class, prejudices all over the place. But that's very different from practicing slavery.
Respecto al racismo, sí que es cierto, pero bueno, como existe en todo el mundo, pero no son los saharauis, o sea, son los marroquíes también. Es decir, la raza árabe es una raza racista con los negros. Aparte de eso, luego existe convivencia. Aquí hay parlamentarios que son de raza negra. Hay desde albañiles que son de raza negra, recogedores de basura que son de raza negra, gente del gobierno que es de raza negra. Y eso quiere decir que hay una cierta integración. En el gobierno español no hay ninguna persona de raza negra.
هنا تياها مثلا الناس حتى قاعد اللي قايد ولا كذا ولا ذاك الضابط ولا كذا مستوي هو ذاك اللي عادي، لان مثلا الجبهه ما هي مراقيه ذاك ولا كذا. شفت حق الله ما خالق نجوم ولا خالق شيء ذنبت ذاك هو باش تعود الناس تمشي عليها المراتب. وحتى هما بالنسبه للناس السود فيهم اللي حتى هما غيات كتائب وغيات فصائل والى اخره.
الانسان يقطع صوم راسه ولا قيمته من خلال خبرته ومهارته وتجربته في المهام القتالية. إذن بصفة مختصرة اللون ما فيه تمييز بالنسبة للعمل، سواء أمام الحقوق متساويين في الحقوق والواجبات. أنا شخصيا ما نفي عن مخالقة ما زالت بقاء العبودية في المجتمع الصحراوي، مجتمع متخلف فيه العاقل وفيه الفيسد وفيه اللي راسه كبير عاد هريم شيخ قباله وفيه مختلف العقليات. لكن بصفة عامة الدولة والنظام والطرح العام كامل ضد ضد العبودية.
En 30 años diría que han hecho mucho más de lo que logró hacer España en 300, en ese sentido. Así que sí, hay racismo como en cualquier sociedad multiétnica. Pero de ahí a decir que esos son esclavos, no, por favor. O sea, yo trabajo con ellos y ni hablar.
The Third Party Congress of the Polisario, which was the first that met after the Exodus, when they found themselves ruling a large percentage of the Sahrawi population, initiated a whole series of sweeping reforms. Among them was the abolition of slavery. From everything I can tell, virtually all of the former slaves became free members of society that have participated fully, politically, economically, and the like. And in my time in the camps, and others I know who've spent more time than I have, noticed that the black Sahrawis were fully integrated in the political and economic life of the community.
Eran gente que antiguamente era esclava y que, bueno, tras la revolución, cuando la esclavitud dejó de existir, parte de esa gente, bueno, cuando soltaron, digamos, soltaron a los esclavos, hubo gente, familias que se quedaron con niños que en ese momento eran niños pequeños y los adoptaron como un miembro más de la familia, y gente que les está formando y les está cultivando para que sean, bueno, pues un miembro más del pueblo saharaui.
Ese tipo de información al final resulta ser un arma política. Es decir, yo no sé si Violeta es tan solo una persona que busca desesperadamente, como la mayoría de los jóvenes periodistas que vienen por acá, el scoop que la haga famosa, y que haciendo eso pierden el sentido que deberían tener de responsabilidad respecto al trabajo que hacen. Pero, sin embargo, ha hecho más daño, evidentemente, que años de información enemiga.
That enemy is Morocco. In 1975, as Morocco invades the Western Sahara, 160,000 Sahrawis flee to Algeria and settle in refugee camps that exist to this day. As they fled, they were attacked by the Moroccan Air Force with napalm and white phosphorus. After the invasion, Morocco built a 2,700-kilometer wall surrounded by the longest continuous minefield in the world. Millions of landmines and over 100,000 Moroccan troops divide a nation and thousands of families. The other half of the Sahrawi population continues to live under brutal Moroccan occupation, in a police state. The torture of Sahrawis, including children, women, and the elderly, is a common occurrence in the occupied territories.
Only people I can imagine that gains from this kind of thing is the Moroccan regime and its supporters, who want to continue rationalizing for this illegal occupation of Western Sahara.
The Moroccan government seized the opportunity and made a film about slavery in the camps, as was shown in a government-run TV station.
Des images inédites qui en disent long sur la répression et la violation des droits de l'homme dans le sud-ouest algérien. Plusieurs personnes à visage découvert y lancent des appels au secours à la communauté internationale, ce qui vient contredire le dernier rapport de l'association Human Rights Watch.
Ces images ont été tournées à Tindouf, un document poignant qui met à nu encore une fois le vrai visage du Polisario, un groupuscule terroriste qui détient des otages marocains et étrangers dans les camps de Tindouf, où l'esclavage a encore la peau dure. La société civile monte au créneau pour dénoncer ces crimes contre l'humanité et rétablir la vérité que le dernier rapport de Human Rights Watch a éludé, preuve en images du cœur même des camps de Tindouf.
This man is Reda Tojni, president of the Moroccan Sahara Association, created by the Moroccan Secret Services to create misinformation about the Western Sahara. He was one of the first people the filmmakers met in Paris after leaving the camps. The film, made by the Moroccans, contains footage from stolen, images of 19th century slavery, and footage shot by Philippe El Gouyal from the Together Foundation in a clear attempt to create propaganda. Philippe El Gouyal is the director of the Together Foundation, a New York-based NGO and a former United Nations official. He organized a press conference for the filmmakers of the United Nations in New York, in which Violeta is quoted as saying that slavery is protected by the law. Salem received a call from Violeta inviting them to go to Mauritania to meet Philippe El Gouyal and Hassan, a Moroccan cameraman.
Primero, Violeta habló sobre el dinero que nosotros que hace falta que ir a Mauritania y encontrar a Felipe y el Hassan, que van a dar el dinero. Ellos me dan 1.340.000 UGIA, el dinero de Mauritania. Parece en euro vale 4.000 euros.
مشات مغاربة يدوروا يتكلموا ويعطوا بطاقاتهم ويعطوا هذا وباو نتيجة على أنه قالوا عنها اللي هو سالم قالوا عنهم هذو مغاربة وعنهم ما هم عاطين لأنهم كذبت عليهم فاهم عنهم لا أصلا صحافة يشتغلوا معاها في أستراليا وعنهم لا من الجمعية المتالبين لها وعن شو نوع من الكلام واللف والدوران.
Ellos les dicen, si ustedes no hablan con nosotros podemos hablar, nosotros tenemos dinero y podemos hablar con cualquier negros. Podemos coger negros de Mauritania y hablar sobre eso. Y decimos que están viviendo en los campamentos en Tindouf.
دخلوني الشمبرة الثانية وفرضوا علي نتكلم قالوا لي ليه تتكلم غصبا عنك قال لي هذا ما فيش احنا ما انك هات لنا كل شيء وقال لي تكلم وذاك يصورون وقلت له
نسكن في مخيمات ونسكن 27 ونعانوا من العودية عندنا في المخيمات إلى حد الآن بزاف تمارس علينا إلى هذه السنة 2008 اللي هو اليوم واحد كاع غريب حالا تمارس علينا العودية.
منين وفينا من الكلام قاموا مالي المهم صورني تصاور عنده هو عند فيليب قال لي هاك سكنهم وصورهم قلت له انا اذا ماني فاهمهم قال لي الموريتاني قلت له قول عني ماني فاهمهم قال لي بدي هذا ما فيهم شيء عادي راهو قال لك عادي لا بعضهم انتم تصور بهم قمت انا وصورت بهم قال عاقب ذاك فوتنا شيء اللي هو مكتوب فيهم شيء في تندوف انا فهمت هذه الكلمات التحتانيه قال لي هو والو قال لي انت هذا ما في شيء هذا انت عدلت وخلاص المهم هذا لا بغيت.
The pictures appeared in a lengthy article in a Moroccan government-controlled magazine in which Dan and Violeta were featured.
Somehow the Moroccans got involved with this film at some stage. They gained access to Violeta and offered her opportunities or the sense or feeling of opportunities and possibly finances and you know every filmmaker struggles to make their films and it's you know it's possible that she was really susceptible to what seemed on offer and the Moroccans would be very interested for sure for any film to come out of the camps that you know reaffirms their propaganda, which is you know that all the refugees there are held there against their will.
نظن عنهم عادلين ذو حقيقة عنهم مشتغلين للمغرب هذا كامل معدل لأنهم مش دايرين هم في هذا مش دايرين فيه إذا أنا نظن حقيقة عن نظام عنهم مشتغلين للمغرب المغرب كاريهم شي باش يدمروا به شعبنا نحن وتوف.
You know I don't know Violeta and I don't know if she's necessarily an evil woman you know but I do think she's really misguided. I really do, and that's a shame because she's just doing a lot of harm. And you know, I would like to think that wasn't her intention.
Il y a des gens qui viennent pour une semaine ou deux, ils pensent et ils croient que pendant cette période, ils peuvent découvrir beaucoup de choses que nous, ça fait presque combien d'années qu'on est ici, qu'on n'a pas vu. Est-ce qu'ils sont mieux orientés que nous, ou bien est-ce qu'ils viennent avec des idées préconçues pour les défendre? C'est tout. Je pense que c'est ça.
It's a common con man thing that you set up a premise and you build on it, but you go with it yourself. You convince yourself as you convince others that this is what occurred. So we have a film with no instance of slavery shown, with instances of slavery mentioned in subtitles which proved to be the opposite of what was actually said, and money paid to men to say they were slaves who later admitted they were paid money to say they were slaves, and a $260,000 budget paid for people who, as far as I can work out, did not involve themselves in much expense to bring back this farrago of lies.
In theory, if you're caught in a lie, there's two things you can do. You say, I'm sorry, I screwed up, or you can go on the offensive and try and bluff your way through. As the situation got worse for the filmmakers in the media and all these factual errors and questions remained unanswered, they went on the offensive. And in addition to saying that Fatim's kids were held as hostages, which was absurd, they said that you were a Polisario agent, which I knew for a fact was absurd. But it rang bells, because I remembered that the Moroccans, when you had been arrested and questioned by them earlier when you made your first film, the Moroccans put out a press release after they released you saying that you worked for Hugo Chavez and Mossad and the CIA.
In 2006, I went to the Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara to make a documentary about the repression of Sahrawi students by the Moroccan authorities. I was detained and interrogated for 8 hours by the notorious Ishi Abu al-Hassan. During interrogation, I was accused of working for the CIA and Israel. The next day, I was expelled to the Canary Islands, and a fabricated confession appeared in the Asaba newspaper of Casablanca. In it, I admitted to being an agent of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez.
Well, now, this whole group, now they're saying you work for the Polisario, the CIA, Mossad, and Hugo Chavez, which makes you, like, more complicated than James Bond.
We invited the filmmakers to comment on camera about this and other apparent discrepancies in the translation, but they refused, instead issuing a statement that the film had been independently verified by 3 separate translators, and describing Carlos Gonzalez's interviews as a pastiche of misinformation released by Polisario to attack the film.
Any kind of misinformation on human rights is a great disservice. There are real human rights violations taking place around the world, and the Polisario's record is not spotless, but it's certainly better than what we've seen in the Moroccan-occupied territories. It certainly does not involve slavery on a massive scale.
And if there is one liberation movement that I know, over the years, you know, many of us, like Fretling in the past, or Swap in the middle, even the ANC, you know, we are a bit embarrassed by some of the things we did. Polisario is one of the most genuine liberation movement and very humanitarian.
One of the big distortions in documentaries now, in my opinion, are these so-called reenactments. And a lot of people do them. But in this film, it struck me, as a director of fiction myself, I've made documentaries, but I direct actors. The reenactments in this, aside from when she was crying, seem particularly disturbing in the escape. As I recall, there's a scene where they're escaping at night, which is obviously recreated because you wouldn't be filming something like that while you're escaping.
I don't think we've misrepresented Fatima. We haven't put words in her mouth. We didn't act out scenes as Kamal Fidel suggests.
Several hours later, trying to get to the UN base, the Polisario found us. And within seconds we were surrounded by police cars.
The filmmakers issued a press release from Paris a few days after leaving the camps. The following day, around 5 p.m., we were picked up by Polisario officials and held for a total of 5 hours. In early May, the sun doesn't set until 7:30 p.m. It could not have been dark. At the 2010 ADC conference in Adelaide, producer Tom Subricki admitted to reenacting these scenes in Cronulla and the Bondi golf course. The filmmakers were found by Polisario officials at the Cuban medical compound after they were alerted by the Cuban doctors. They were not picked up in the middle of the night, as portrayed in the film.
Fueron alrededor de 2 horas aquí. 2 horas aquí que estuvieron conversando, tratando de... Pero, lógicamente...
¿Qué decía ella en esas 2 horas?
Bueno, conversaba de cosas, de temas normales, de la salud normal, tratando de familiarizarse con nosotros, porque bueno, es que nunca la habíamos conocido. Y entonces eran temas de salud, temas de normal, de asistencia médica, de un problema de una patología determinada de ella, para tratar de buscar el rapport con nosotros y luego tener la confianza adecuada como que para que nosotros le diéramos la posibilidad de quedarnos. ¿Entiendes? Lo que lo hizo tan rápido y tan desesperado que no le dio tiempo, pues claro. Y además muy sospechosos, por cierto. Pidiéndote hospedaje por ahí casi a la fuerza. Y uno se pregunta por qué tú vienes así tan nervioso y insistiendo tanto. Recibiendo llamadas, saliendo de donde estás tú, ocultándote hasta cierto punto de las llamadas telefónicas y nervioso, ¿no? ¿Entiendes? Por eso todo eso nos hizo sospechar, aparte de eso, toda la cantidad de bultos que traían, ¿entiendes? Lo del dinero que se lo robaron. Eran muchas cosas que evidenciaban al final de que era una conducta que no estaba acorde con el trabajo que ellos vinieron a hacer.
The film is getting a lot of attacks because it's a film that exposes something that these governments, the Polisario and Morocco, been trying to hide for a very long time.
Most of the people involved in this, in these criticisms of the film, didn't know these filmmakers at all. You're talking about a wide cross-section of media who didn't know these people. So this is not a personal, vindictive kind of witch hunt or anything. This basically is celebrating truth. And since we're filmmakers, we're journalists, we're media people, we like truth. We think there should be reasonably objective facts portrayed in a documentary, especially if you're making very serious allegations like slavery. You better have your facts.
You know, if this woman or this filmmaker had taken some time to do some research, do some background reading, because it doesn't sound to me like she's done any, and just actually going to the source, just looking at the fundamental sort of paperwork that exists, documentation that exists about, you know, the Sahrawi sort of government and constitution, she would see it very clearly the law does not in any way support slavery.
It's also symptomatic of what I find is an Australian tendency of young filmmakers to invade like 19th century missionaries, the third world, and find irregularities in their society which they then beat up into sensational stories and bring back, and only coincidentally make $250,000 for themselves out of kicking back no money to the people who have been so tyrannised already. It's a nasty business.
I think there's a bit of first world arrogance in the treatment of these third world people in a refugee camp. Oh, who cares? They're not going to get lawyers to defend themselves. That seemed to be the attitude, because if Australian citizens had been portrayed like this without permission, they would take legal advice immediately and the film would be stopped, or they'd have to take out the scenes. I mean, it is absolutely normal in movies and in documentaries to get releases. And as we understood it at the time, no releases had been obtained for these people.
The team wrote a letter to producer Tom Zubricki asking to be removed from the film. Her request was ignored.
هي فرميتها الكارطة ذيك جاتنا فرميتها مولي بلا طرتي وكل شيء مباشرة فرميتها عني ماني باقي نعود في ذي الكل شيء كامل محرف فيها والله بشي خاسر والله جايب العبودية والله بأي شيء منين شت وانا كامل ذنبته وقعت عني ماني فيها ولاني شيء كامل قالتوا عنه والله مرقتوا عنه راهي ما هي رانا مالنا مسؤولين عنه يسوى هو شنو هو.
¿Esta es tu firma?
Sí. Es mi firma. Mira. Es mi letra.
Es tu letra, ¿no?
Sí, sí.
¿Y tú sabes lo que dice esta carta? ¿Te lo explicaron?
Sí, sí.
Sí, ¿no?
قولوا عني قريته كامل بالعربية قريب مولي لأنه جا مترجم بالعربي وبالإسباني.
Cuando ellos trajeron el papel estaba en español, en inglés y en árabe.
يقراوك مزات.
قعدت معاقل العائلة كلها عاد قاع شاك في الثاني
منهم هما اللي يقولوا عن احنا رانا شهدنا بنات عليها هي انا والوالده ما لنا قاريات وترجمتها هي بياسر وكذبت بياسر وقالت عن احنا قايلين ياسر وقولتنا قاعد ما نقولوا قولتوا احنا هون وقولتوا لنا لهذه جهات اياها. كذيبها هي اللي كذبت علينا اللي ما وضد راني ضد افكار فيوليتا مشى هذا حي مولي.
قول له عني من اللي كنت شفتهم في ذا الوقت اللي نقول لهم عني اولا كاع حاقرتهم نوع من الحقره ما كيفش لي اني ما كنت شاكه عن اشخاص ذاك نبتهم جاوني النهار الاول واستقبلتهم وفتحت لهم مكاني كامل وعدلتهم كيف اخوتي واعطيتهم كل شيء اعطيتهم جهدي واعطيتهم كل شيء وفتحت لهم ابوابي واستقبلتهم الاستقبال الزين في الاخير يوقعونا في نوع من الفخ ما كنت شاكه ما كنت نظن عنهم ذا وضريكم مولي منين يوقفوا قدامي اللي نمحيهم من الوجود نشك عنهم كاع ما هم خالقين منين يوقفوا قدامي اللي نشك عني ماني شايفتهم لا مولي نوع من الحقره لهم كاع ذاك العدل كامل يروح ولا وشي ضاحي ليش وكذبوا مولي كامل.
Dense cuenta que acá hay el 80% de los niños en estado de desnutrición, 33% están en estado de desnutrición severa crónica. Tenemos el 80% de las mujeres fértiles en anemia terminal. No tenemos en ese momento escoltas de alimentos nada más que para 40 días y tenemos que poner nuestra energía para investigar lo que es muy probablemente el fruto de una mentalité omitomane.
Mais on a besoin d'autre chose, on a besoin de parler de nourriture, de parler d'autre chose, de parler de choses qui sont réelles. La malnutrition ici, elle est réelle, mais la maltraitance, elle est fictive. Et c'est ça qui pousse les gens qui m'a poussé sans aucun engagement ni de votre production de vous, mais je m'engage à dire une réalité que personne ne m'a poussé à la dire.
Unfortunately, there's not everyone's got integrity in the filmmaking industry, and people are out there just to get a story because they want to get their name out there, and they'll do anything to make that happen. And you know, I kind of, unfortunately, I sort of sense that that's a bit of what's going on. So I think it is the responsibility of festivals and people in the community that are promoting important films about human rights issues. I think it is really their responsibility to be quite rigorous about screening these and really, you know, not just, oh, it's human rights and then just kind of, but really, you know, I think there is a need for that, definitely. It's a shame, but you know, there's no doubt about that.
Beyond all this thing about this movie, which is really a tiny bit of this whole issue, the movie just sparked interest in the Western Sahara. But the really serious thing here is the Western Sahara situation, which is called the forgotten conflict and has been going on for far too long. And it's just, it's one of the tragic situations going on in the world now that this country was invaded. And it's never been sorted out despite various efforts. And, you know, I don't know how you judge conflicts, you know, which starving kid without a country is more important than the other starving kid without a country? They're all the same. This needs some attention. And I guess the positive aspect of this really mediocre movie, full of inaccuracies, if there's a positive aspect, it has brought attention to the plight of the West Saharan people.
Je pense que le Minurso est là. Je pense que les Nations Unies sont là. Je pense que je trouve mieux que les Nations Unies parlent de ça, de ce problème-là, qui ramènent des experts et qui travaillent sur ce plan-là, que d'avoir des journalistes, ou pour ne pas les dénigrer, de prendre un article et de faire un documentaire et de dire voilà, ça c'est réel, ça c'est une insulte à nous, ONG, aux Nations Unies, au UNHCR, à pas mal d'organisations qui travaillent depuis combien d'années ici et ils n'ont pas vu ces gens, je veux dire, c'est pratique.
Es terrible qu'una vez que haya la posibilidad de hablar para mí delante de una cámara, ¿Sabes? Mi trabajo es justamente eso, ¿no? El monitoreo de la ayuda alimentaria. Hace 2 años y medio que estoy denunciando esa situación. Hace 2 años y medio que nadie quiere escuchar. Pero acá estoy hoy día hablando de los problemas psicológicos de Violeta. No sé, me crea mucho conflicto esa cosa, digo la verdad, me crea muchísimo conflicto. Me gustaría tener acceso a la información para darte todos los números del genocidio. Los esclavos son los esclavos, ¿sabes qué? Están muriendo, esa es la verdad. Y no es por voluntad de ellos, es por voluntad del Occidente.